Hello and welcome to Authors Die Twice, a podcast about video games and aesthetic theory hosted by two living failures. In this episode, we talk about the 2023 action role-playing game Lies of P. We think through some impressions or lack of impressions of it, wonder about the intertwined roles of the clown and the puppet, both in the game and in horror more broadly, and we briefly touch on Heinrich von Kleist's 1810 story on the Marionette Theater to consider the relationship between the automaton and the human. We hope you enjoy.
So, Brian, we're going to do something a little unusual today, which is that several months ago, we decided to cover Lies of P. I want to say it was around Halloween because we were covering Bloodborne then and sort of figured that Lies of P as essentially a Bloodborne clone would be a nice sort of thematically appropriate, even for like a sort of Halloween or post-Halloween schedule. Um, and then we just got distracted with other things. Silent Hill F came out, other things came out, and we both have other stuff going on with work. So we're now in a weird situation where you've been playing Lies of P over the past few weeks, right? Or even the past few months. I haven't touched it since like September. So we are going to attempt to talk about Lies of P, the game that
Mhm.
I've actually played a lot of. I've beaten it three times, I think. I played the DLC over the summer, but it's been a while now, and um, I would say it's not a game that sticks in my memory very well, even though it's a game that I really enjoy playing. So uh, I thought we could just start unstructured here. I mean, Where are you in the game, and what are you thinking so far?
Yeah, so a few things I think what I had said is that it feels like a we did the Bloodborne for Halloween. It feels like a Christmas Bloodborne. Maybe it's like the Nutcracker associations or something. Um I'm not so yeah, I think you're right to say that it doesn't really stick in your mind because I enjoy it a lot too, but it doesn't, it feels I wonder if there's a way we can get a little closer to defining this or giving a name to it, but something that it's not quite just a time killer, but something that you enjoy, but yet leaves kind of not much of an impression, Like the impression that I get of this game is the gameplay, not necessarily like the atmosphere or like any events. I mean, I already don't know what's happening in Bloodborne, and I love Bloodborne. So, I mean, that's a bit of an exaggeration, but I think you know what I mean. So, I have no clue what's going on in this game, and I did have to watch or listen to a couple of videos that kind of explain the plot. And I do think there are a couple interesting, like, thematic questions that we can think about because this question of, humanity and puppetry and whatever automata could be good to think about. But where I'm at right now, I've defeated the puppet that I think is called Romeo, um, who I gather was the your character's friend when they were alive or something like this. So I beat that part, and then I kind of went into this infected downstairs or whatever, like cellar kind of area that you just keep getting decay or whatever it's called, disintegration or something. And then I got attacked and killed by a really angry, aggressive puppet thing. And I haven't played since then. So,
Yeah, I think the Romeo fight's it is a in a way it's a highlight of the game for me, but it also is emblematic of the kind of derivative nature of the aesthetic. I mean, I think you're totally right that this game doesn't have it has it despite having a pronounced visual style, it really doesn't have an atmosphere. And maybe that's partly because it's like I think it's made in like Unreal Engine and it has a kind of generic 2020s video game look. Just everything about it is a little bit samey and familiar. Um, but the Romeo fight aesthetically, I mean, first of all, it's like it's a good case study for thinking about aesthetics because it's like starts with a little puppet show, like a little play. Like so everyone in Liza P is a puppet, but of course they are visually indistinguishable from humans. Like they move totally fluid. So I guess the advanced puppets like you, whereas I guess there are enemy puppets who look more like automata. But the super puppets, of which you are one and Romeo is one, look just like humans. Um, so then there's this kind of like doubling where, despite looking like humans, Romeo puts on a play with puppets beforehand, that look even more like puppets than the puppets that you're fighting. So you get both, you get two extremes of mimesis or lifelikeness between Romeo's puppets and Romeo the puppet who's controlling everything. And then you first fight Romeo inside of a giant nutcracker type puppet, and then he comes out. Um, and so this whole preamble feels very near Automata. Near Automata is a game. I don't think you've played it, Brian, right? You haven't mentioned it, but there are also like there are these robots that look like little toy robots, goofy, essentially like puppets. It's. I mean, I'll talk a bit more later, I think, about um, robots and puppets together as video game entities,
Mm,
but. Near Automata, you are an android who looks just like a human, and like an exaggerated sort of like sexy, but super powered human. But you're still like sort of have fluid movements in the way that a human would or might. In fact, everyone in Near Automata is a robot. I'm pretty sure, even when they seem to be humans. So it has a similar dichotomy between like the kind of robot looking robots and the non-robot looking robots.
yeah.
Um, but there's lots of play with aesthetic distance and with kind of, I guess, sort of mise en abîme of puppetry. There's one famous boss fight against an opera singer puppet, or rather robot, who I think even has puppets. Like I want to say puppets factor into that uh level. I could be wrong, but in any case, a kind of like foregrounded and reflexive aestheticization of what is already a construct, i.e., a robot.
Right.
So that's happening in Lies of P, and then it shifts immediately or subsequently rather to this boss fight against this guy who busts out of the giant uh like fake looking, or artifice looking robot puppet and becomes Raiden from MGS4. So when we covered Metal Gear Solid 4, we didn't talk about what happens, I think, or when we covered the Metal Gear Solid series, we didn't really cover what happens in 4, which is that Raiden reappears as like the ultimate badass cyborg. And then there's a whole game, Metal Gear Rising Revengeance, where you play as Raiden.
Mm.
And Romeo looks exactly like Raiden and even has some of like Raiden's signature moves. Um, and so it's a long-winded way of saying that this game is a sort of hodgepodge of imitations, fittingly for a game about puppets, I guess. And that we have Nier, we have Metal Gear Solid, and of course we have the Dark Souls or the Soulsborne series, which is it would seem to be its closest inspiration, but actually aesthetically maybe things like Nier, and even in this case Metal Gear might be a little bit closer.
Yeah, I think that's a nice distinction to make. Although one thing I'll say is that, you know, the obvious comparison with Bloodborne in terms of maybe some of the visual stuff, and then, of course, with Sekiro with some of the mechanics. One other way that I see there being kind of like again, I'm only reconstructing this from having to look at lore videos, because I think a lot of it I'm just kind of playing it on, as it were, autopilot, as if I'm an automaton. Um, but it does seem that there's these kind of two worlds of the game, or two paths, like there is kind of in Bloodborne, like there's the Victorian and then the kind of cosmic in Bloodborne. Whereas here there's all these puppets, and there are humans, but the humans are also afflicted by this kind of disease, right? And that seems to be like that's what's causing this kind of odd conflict. So it doesn't have the same structure, same relation as Bloodborne, but it does kind of feel like one of those, that mechanic of having two separate uh worlds that are colliding in a certain way, and I think uh I'm not sure too much what to make of that yet, because I'm not even really too aware of how far into the story I am after just defeating Romeo. It seems like there should still be quite a bit to go. I will say, just again, like I'm enjoying the game, but I think part of my, resistance or distance to it is that the puppets feel, I mean, first of all, dark puppets is kind of a trope, right? Like even in Devil May Cry, there's like the marionette things with the scythes. scythe blades on their hands or whatever, like the guillotine blade things. Um, and even in horror, right? There's puppet stuff. We can think about even Sandman by Hoffman, right? Which Freud writes about in The Uncanny, is all about the guy, basically falling in love with the sort of puppet thing. Um, but I wonder if it's worth talking because I don't know if you had a chance to read Kleist's Marionette Theater piece, which gives us something I think quite different from the horror puppet, right? It's in a way it's maybe kind of a has some dark elements to it, I think, as a story, but it's not this kind of overblown gothic Victorian puppet horror, which just I think to me, like maybe this is why I wonder if you'd agree, maybe this is why I don't really nothing is leaving an impression on me because it feels like um, this game is maybe for people who are really, really into Renaissance fairs and also Insane Clown Posse or something like that. So I'm not like so much into that. It also feels like Art Deco style for some reason too, which I just don't really, I'm not really too interested in that. Like some of the areas almost look like I don't know, BioShock or something like that. There's a lot of weird stuff going on in terms of the architecture and the visual styles, but no, I was just gonna say I do think the puppet question is an interesting question with this game,
The puppet question. Yeah.
The-
The BioShock is a great comparison because it does have that kind of I guess it's like Belle Epoque or whatever. It's what I've
Mm,
seen just bandied about in reviews of the game,
sure.
or Art Deco, but it has a very BioShock vibe too, in that there's like this you see advertisements, right, for these handy puppets, like the way of the future, and then it
Yeah.
turns out puppets murder everybody. BioShock is another, I think, aesthetic point of reference for sure. And yeah, the Kleist story, I read it this morning, and honestly, it blew my mind. I was hoping we might talk about it because it's like 4 pages long, and it's just an incredible piece of writing.
Yeah.
So I do think we should cover that, and maybe it would help if you could lead us into it because I imagine most listeners will not, or at least many listeners will not have read Kleist or even know about him, if anything at all.
Yeah, so I think so for a long time this was the only so it's by Heinrich von Kleist. It was the only Kleist I had read. I think now the other thing that I've read by Kleist, which is also well known, is called Michael Kohlhaas, which is an amazing story, kind of novella or novel about this guy who certainly is like was an inspiration for Kafka. There's even a really particular scene with a gate that kind of makes me think of some of the gate imagery in Kafka, which is very much a strange story of revenge. I would definitely recommend it. But the Marionette Theater, it's kind of it almost feels like a much older story than it is. Like it feels, it's essentially a dialogue, and it's a short dialogue between these two men who kind of exchange stories. And so Paul Damon has a really famous reading of it called Aesthetic Formalization. That's definitely worth looking at too. But just to tick, stick a, to stick to the story for a second. Um, the first story is about the Marionette Theater. So the narrator's friend, has just gone and seen some performance at the Marionettes and is kind of he's marveling at how graceful these puppets are, right? And he says that it all has to do with the person controlling the puppets and the sense of grace that the puppets have has to do partly with their um, in a way like passivity or their kind of like ability to be kind of like a jellyfish and go with the flow in terms of where their limbs are going and the kind of axis that they're turning on. Um, then there's this middle story that's really interesting where I think it's the narrator tells a story of having kind of this ephebe young man friend who looks at himself and uh, sort of is accidentally replicating the gesture that they had just seen in this statue, and then tries to do it again and tries to do it again. It just doesn't work. And it actually, in that sense, reminds me of, Remainder a little bit by Tom McCarthy, right? The sense that we can, or the question or paradox of trying to replicate a certain moment of grace, I guess you could say, right? Um, and then the final one is the original guy is fencing with his friends like young sons or whatever, and he keeps beating them because he's an adult. and then they bring out a bear, like a trained bear that's tied to a stake, and the bear just completely destroys him at fencing. Like he cannot make a move on this bear at all, right? And so it's a question of like, I don't know, maybe of mastery, of grace, of of form as well. But I guess I want to hear like what you thought about this story because it's difficult, right? It's like deceptively simple, I guess, but there's a lot of pretty strange and interesting things going on here.
Yeah, it's the perfect companion piece to Lives of P, and it obviously exceeds it in terms of just like how much interesting stuff is going on. But a couple stray thoughts at first. To start, you can fence with a bear in Lies of P's DLC. I'm pretty sure there
Hmm.
are very fearsome bear enemies in the zoo. The first area you traverse is a zoo that's been taken over by monsters. And while I don't know if the bear can parry you, you can certainly parry the bear. So it's a nice little reversal of the conclusion of the Marionette Theater. I now feel like for this episode, I'm not gonna be able to do it, but I wish we could go in and like get a screen grab of the puppet fighting the bear with a rapier.
Yeah.
Um, the larger thought about this story, two larger thoughts. One, on the maximally general level, um, this piece blew my mind because it feels so modernist. I mean, it feels like it makes sense that a deconstructionist like Paul Deman would write about it because it's radically anti-humanistic. I mean, I think the through line connecting several of the story, or at least two of the episodes is that um, dancers fail when they seem too human, when when there's affect and there is intention and self-consciousness. Dancers aspire to the condition of the inorganic. That dancers actually are most compelling and most beautiful when they just seem like puppets, when they are pure form and pure matter, in motion rather than people, you know. And this is the state of grace that you mentioned with the story about the beautiful young boy in the second episode. That this young man thoughtlessly and unselfconsciously does this gesture that reminds both of them of a classical sculpture that they just seen. But then, when the young man realizes that he resembles the sculpture by looking in a mirror, he then falsifies it, and in trying to then recapture it or recreate that moment of analogy or identity really with the inorganic with an art with a piece of with an art with an artificial construct with a work of art, he becomes more and more self-conscious, more and more narcissistic, and more grotesque or comical. And so here it's precisely self-consciousness of one's own form, that destroys the appreciation of form. And what this reminded me of, if I can now transition to my other general thought, and this may be long-winded, but um, I did think about video games and lifelikeness and puppets or artifice, which are, like just maybe the core themes of this podcast, from the jump. But I guess one way in would be when we talked about Jonathan Bolter's book, Parables of the Posthuman. I think I had something of, I was thinking then about the way that cyborgs justify the sort of fundamental artificiality of video game, you know, um, uh, uh, entities or beings, and that they're often, creatures or people in games, humans in games are often stiff and jerky and unnatural, and making them cyborgs naturalizes that, right? Justifies this sort of technological failing with a sci-fi explanation or in-universe explanation. And puppets do the same thing. And yet in Lies of P, it's like uh, something of a paradox in that the humans in Lies of P are far more puppet-like than the puppets. In that the few humans we know, like Geppetto, are just these static NPCs who don't react to anything and just stand or sit in the same exact place and recycle the same dialogue. Whereas like the puppets are the ones who seem to have a wider range of possible experiences or even just animations. Um, that is to say, even on a basic level of like animation or dance, on the level of bodily movement, the puppets are far more realized in Lies of P than the humans are. Um, and so there is a sense that the puppets, especially the super puppets, like the protagonist, are like more human or more real than the humans. And this is interestingly sort of doubled or inverted in Bloodborne. I mentioned this in the Bloodborne book, but that like the one character who seems to have real interiority and self-consciousness is the doll, who is a puppet, right?
Mm.
Whereas everybody else in Bloodborne is just so radically inhuman, even the characters who are supposed to be human. And that's the case where I mean, I'm kind of just stumbling towards this, but if we were to read this along the lines of the first and second episodes in the Kleist story, um, maybe that's why Bloodborne is beautiful and aesthetically compelling, and Lies of P is not in the same way. Because
Mm.
in Bloodborne, the humans behave like inorganic matter. The humans behave like robots or puppets without explanation, and the game isn't self-conscious like the beautiful young man. It's not looking at itself in the mirror and asking like, do I look like this thing? Do I look right? Um, we might think of like mocap here, like game, maybe it's just a failing that games try to do motion capture because it speaks to a kind of self-consciousness about their own appearance and their own attempts to imitate something, in this case, human life and human movements. Whereas games that totally abandon that or simply don't care about it are utterly unself-conscious in the way that Souls games are, can therefore seem more absorbing, to kind of return to another trope of our discussions. Whereas in Lies of P, it's like the puppets are made to look human, and the human characters, the few ones that there are, feel puppet-like. I guess I came all the way here and now I'm not sure where I want to go with this, but so why don't you rescue me?
Well, I want to make a distinction then between how humans are puppet-like in both games because I think they're different, right? I think in Bloodborne, they do behave like puppets, but I would say that maybe if not grace, they do have a certain restraint that the human characters in Lies of P don't maybe have. So like I mean, just the nature of the dialogue in pretty much all From Software games is so bizarre and kind of elliptical and obscure. And if you go and talk to anybody in not that this is necessarily meant as like a positive, qualification, but if you go and, knock on a door in Bloodborne, right, they're going to only reply to you one or two times, and that dialogue option is then going to be like lost. They'll reply to you, and maybe you'll literally knock, and there will be an ellipsis, right? There will be no more to say. Whereas I think that, the humans are puppet-like in Lies of P insofar as they're always available, at least as far as I can tell, which to me feels different. They feel more like an archive than something that would be performing at the caliber of a puppet in terms of having grace or having some kind of uh something that is inhuman in a way that exceeds the human, which is I think what Kleist is talking about, or something that is like, because at the end of the story too, he talks about how the two poles of this are either God or inorganic matter, essentially, right? The human
Yeah.
is doomed to be in between the two, and that's why, that's maybe the dark part of the story. I don't know if that sort of makes sense
It
as a
does.
distinction.
Yeah. And I would say another distinction to add to what you're pointing out is that the puppets and the humans alike in Lies of P are more emotive. And
Mhm.
that makes sense because it's ultimately we buried the lead here. It's ultimately an adaptation of Pinocchio. So the capacity of these automatons to have emotion is thematically central. And you can learn to play the piano or to pet a cat, and to lie. That's a sort of underexplored mechanic, but a key mechanic in the game is your ability to lie to people, to get I think it's usually good to lie, as I remember, because that advances plots and increases your humanity. Um, I do think there's something interesting there, sort of on the ideas level, but I it's fairly dim to me right now. But yeah, your own character is a blank slate and totally non-emotive, but other characters are more emotive. Romeo is emotive in a
Mhm.
way that characters in FromSoft games just never are. Like, does any character show emotion other than madness, or pain? Usually, I think in almost all cases, not.
So yeah, I mean the other thing too that I would say is that, and this was not, again, this is all backtracking that I had to do in terms of looking at a lore video or something, but I mean the character that you play as is literally Geppetto's, not just his creation, but it's his reanimated son who had died, right? So he both is and is not, like he's both a human, humanoid and a puppet at the same time. And I think that as far as I can tell, you can take that in either direction in terms of the story, right? Like you can, depending on multiple endings, you can, like, kind of align with the human or align with the puppet. And that is something that, I mean, I think that is interesting in the ideas level. I guess I'm not sure how it plays out because I haven't finished the game yet, but it seems tethered though, at the same time as I'm saying is that it's interesting. It seems tethered on this kind of drama of Geppetto and his son in a way that something like Bloodborne, again to go back there, kind of exceeds, right? There's something still pretty pretty inscrutable and fairly bizarre to quote the title of a recent episode about Bloodborne, right? Even if we have these kind of explanations for particular motivations or whatever, they're still always kind of outside of the world or something that's hidden. Whereas with Geppetto, it just seems like this kind of sentimental um, thing that is guiding, not only reanimating his son, but also like messing seemingly with like everything else that's going on. Like, because I think it turns out that Geppetto is causing a lot of the uh, violence and other things that are happening in this city.
Yes, yeah. Geppetto, it would be like if Gehrman in Bloodborne turned out to be your dad or something. And was like, "Oh, come to me, my son," at the very end before he chops off your head. Yeah, that's all true, and it is ringing a bell now. I'm gonna, characteristically mangle the lore here, but I want to say, isn't it something like you? I guess you've watched lore videos more recently, but isn't there some revelation that Geppetto wants you, he actually planned the outbreak of puppet killing so that you can get stronger by killing puppets. I mean,
Yeah, I think that's
that's like this plot line, that's like the twist for every one of these damn games. It's like,
yeah.
oh, actually, and it's fundamentally reflexive. It's like, oh,
Mhm.
actually, you playing the game was the plan all along,
Right.
because they wanted you to get stronger.
Yeah,
It's
it's
like
like the Metal Gear, right?
exactly. Metal Gear
Mhm.
Solid 2 is the ultimate version of this, and it's the superior version because it's ironic,
Mhm.
but Metal Gear Solid 2 says or reveals at the end that you are supposed to play through this game and become the ultimate soldier, which is of course what playing the game is, as a kind of social experiment, or experiment in social control, and psychological sculpting, right? Whereas many other games, I'm thinking of like, what are the other ones? There's so many here, but it's like, oh, you were supposed to go get the four shinies. It was our plan all along, so you would become strong enough, right, to be the vessel for this thing, or to fulfill my ends, as the villain or the puppet master, so to speak, of this plot. So yeah, Geppetto is of course literally the puppet master and is co-opting this very, if I'm right, if I'm right about this, is co-opting this very well-worn video game plot structure, and remotivating it. And maybe I've again talked myself all the way around in a circle. Maybe in that case, it's a little bit better or more interesting because it's so on the nose, right? Because he is the puppet master.
Yeah.
Um, and it's this artificial plot in a story about artifice, or rather a plot about artifice. Um, that all is somewhat interesting to me. Uh, but even so, like, I agree with you that there's more plotting and plot here than one finds in a Souls game, and it it doesn't really compel me at all. I will say the gameplay is quite good and the graphics
It
are good
is.
and it runs better than any FromSoft game. Um, and I don't want this to be a session of just dumping on Lies of P because I think as a game, I think it's a great game. I played a lot of this game.
Yeah.
And I particularly like the customization in terms of combat. You have a much wider array of abilities. It almost feels like Neo. I'm playing Neo 3 now, and it's instant game of the year for me. I mean, it's an amazing game, but Neo games give you so many things you can do in combat, and Lies of P, in a way, gives. It's not as developed and as complex as Neo, but it does. You have like the grapple. You have this whole set of alternate move sets you can acquire, or ultimate movement options or abilities that totally change how you play. And then you have the classics, dodge and swing, Bloodborne rhythm, but then you also have the parry game that you can use a la Sekiro, and they're all mashed together in a way that flows pretty well, and it doesn't feel like a bunch of different game systems grafted on into one work. It feels like they're all of a piece, and you can transition very seamlessly between parrying an enemy and using your Legion arms, is that what they're called?
Mm.
To grapple, right, or to use the shield or the rockets, and then you can then all amidst a normal Bloodborne-esque battle.
Yeah, I guess one thing I'd say, because, ostensibly, and it really is, you know, uh, I mean, maybe this is the first, I don't know if I've played another Soulsborne, but like this feels incredibly on the nose in terms of pretty much every aspect of it, right? Is essentially like lifted from, mechanics wise, and even some of the scenery is essentially lifted from some of the different From Software games. But oddly it seems, and again, yeah, I'm trying to be like, you know, critical in the sense that I'm analyzing it and not just critiquing it, in a negative sense. It does feel to be much lower stakes. Like even combat seems
Yeah.
lower stakes, even though there's no real reason why that should be the case, because the combat works and is in the exact same way. Um, and I wonder what that is. I wonder if like there is a greater distance created just because of the aesthetics of the game and the choices that were made to have everything be this kind of puppet, again, like this dark carnival puppet centric sort of thing, which as you just kind of said, that maybe the game is better because it has this, whatever, this kind of circling back to the narrative. I forget exactly how to say the point that you made, but maybe that's one thing that makes it better. I wonder if one thing that is compelling about the game in terms of it being some kind of horror game, is that I don't, I mean, we're all in a certain way maybe afraid of clowns, right? I mean, there's like there is a I don't necessarily have like a clown phobia, but being afraid of clowns is like a category of thing now, or already it's kind of like how you would expect spiders, you would expect there to be creepy clown puppet things. And the fact of that, which for me creates distance, right? I don't encounter a clown puppet as simply a clown puppet. It's within now the category of clown puppets. Um, that then creates like another order of interaction with that thing. So there's the moment where, and I ended up just running past it because I was tired of trying to fight it. But there's this long street that you go into, and it has those stationary puppet things that fire rockets at you, and then it has ones with flamethrowers. And then there's this big fat clown. I forget, it's called like Mad Clown or something like that. And he does like a punch, and the arm goes all the way, like it kind of extends, and it's really over the top, but he has this kind of, creepy looking face and stuff. And I think there's something to be said about how it's not the same thing, but you know, it's like some of the darkest stuff can happen in a brightly lit film, or in, even something that's metaphorically bright. And I wonder if there's something to be said for there being like, this creepy clown thing that I'm not supposed to think that this is just a scary, creepy clown that came out of nowhere. It's like it's within a world where that's an aesthetic. And like therefore that is a little bit darker to me now because I'm encountering it in that way. I don't know if any of that makes sense, but
I think so. I mean, so first of all, that clown, I know what you're talking about, the mad clown, and it should have been called the insane clown puppet.
yes, yes, definitely.
But the I take it you're saying that um although we would expect puppets, we would expect clowns, as it were, in a work of horror, um, we wouldn't expect a world where everything is a clown, and it's like maybe that lends a higher degree of madness. I'm reminded this is probably like NSFW or whatever for authors die twice, but I'm gonna say it anyway. It's a theory reference, so I have an alibi in that. But Freud has this famous or not famous, famous to me because it lives, it just lives in my mind, which that maybe is outing myself in some way. But he has this moment, I forget even what essay it is, but he says like the difference between a neurotic and someone suffering from psychosis is that a neurotic will see a flower and think it's a vagina, but only a psychotic would look at a field of flowers and see a field of vaginas. Um, and maybe that's what's going on with with Lies of P and puppets, right? That if in a world where everything is an insane clown puppet, maybe you're actually at some degree of like creative psychosis, or or like or it's so derivative that it becomes sublime, and hence more interesting in that way.
Yeah, I mean, we really need to be down to clown in that sense. Um, well, this is kind of making me think about it. So I read, I know I sent it to you kind of late last night, but I was reading. I just happened to open it and I realized I saw the title of the story, and I just had gotten this book from Interlibrary Loan, a Thomas Ligotti book called Teatro Grotesco, which I've heard, I've read some of his stories before, but I'd heard that that one was like kind of the one to read. So I was just flipping through it and I happened to open to a story called The Clown Puppet. No joke. And so I read it quickly last night, and it's about, this narrator who's working. It totally, I mean, I do think you should read it eventually because it could exist within the world of Lies of P. There's a narrator who's working in a medicine shop, which is already like seems like it's from that time, that kind of time period. Um, and it keeps talking about how there are these visitations that happen. And so occasionally he'll just be visited by a clown puppet that comes out of nowhere and is like a life-size clown puppet and isn't really threatening, but will come and like ask him to fill a prescription. But like not say anything, but we'll just hand him a piece of paper and he has to like fill the prescription, or and then he'll kind of interact with them, and the clowns never are hurt him or anything like that, and he doesn't really seem afraid of it, but it's just viewed as this banal and still kind of horrifying, but partly horrifying because of how banal it is. So it does kind of make me think of recently, like the banality of horror and vice versa. Um, but he keeps using this phrase like probably 20 times, outrageous nonsense. So he keeps saying like this is going to be, essentially this is nothing but outrageous nonsense. This is the most outrageous nonsense. And it happens before the clown comes, but it also is a phrase that keeps showing up after the clown is there, the clown puppet, and throughout the entire story, there's just this sense that this is outrageous nonsense. And so there's a sense maybe of like absurdity, or like the norm is now outrageous nonsense, and that's how we kind of have to approach this, yeah, field of clowns or whatever. There is though an interesting moment in the story that maybe I wonder if it maybe connects with both the game and maybe the Kleist, because he remarks that normally with a puppet, right, the expressiveness, just like in Kleist, the expressiveness is in the limbs, not in the face. Uh, but in this particular story with this particular puppet, there's a kind of expressiveness of the face, um, which I find to be really interesting because I think that, you know, maybe not always, but when you do get a glimpse of a face of one of the puppets in Lies of P. It's kind of, I mean, there are puppets everywhere, but it's only, I think, a little bit rarely that you really get a look at one of their faces because, some of the puppets are incredibly fast. Some of them, um, especially if you play in an aggressive way like I do, like I just try to dispatch them like very quickly. Um, but when you do see their faces, it kind of reminds me of some parts of Silent Hill F as well. They are kind of frozen in these like really bizarre but pretty expressive, facial gestures or, kind of facial expressions. Um, and in the sense that I mean, I'll also say like they're automata, I guess, but they're also, I mean, if they're puppets without a puppet master, which is another thing to kind of maybe think about. I don't know what to make of that yet. But they don't seem to be, in terms of humanity, they're not on par with your player character, right? They're not like reanimated sons of Geppetto. They're just these other puppets that have somehow been given like animacy or something. But they don't have, I mean, they don't seem to have a consciousness, right? They don't have any kind of interiority, which again I do find interesting. I think it's a matter of playing out and seeing what else happens in the game for me at least.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to end because now that we're talking about it, I am really curious about what you think, what you'll think of the ending. And did you get the DLC version Overture? Um,
I'm actually not sure. I know that I got it on sale, so maybe it was a bundle. I'll have to look. But
the DLC is honestly fantastic. It's my favorite part of the game. The ending is very funny because you fight, it just becomes full Dark Souls. Like it transforms from Bloodborne into The Last of Us when you get those zombies that act exactly like The Last of Us zombies. Have you gotten there yet? Probably, right? Well,
uh,
you did the church, right? Did you traverse like the church and everything? The cathedral, and you fight that giant monster, the bishop or the pontiff or whatever.
did I?
This is a good test of like, can you remember Lies of P? I feel like
That's
this
the
could
thing.
be
Yeah,
Authors Die Twice parlor game is did it happen in Lies of P or did it not?
yeah, I have the tendency to say yes, but I actually can't remember, so I'm not 100% sure.
Well,
Um,
anyway, you end up fighting an enemy. The arch enemy is named Manus or Manus and has a giant hand. Who's exactly? I mean, there's a Manus in who's the final, really the sort of the final boss of the DLC in the first Dark Souls, and easily the
mm,
hardest boss in that whole game.
mm,
Um, and you fight him on top of like this giant castle that is has nothing in common with the aesthetic of the game until then. You know, it's like a medieval castle workshop. It actually, did you ever play Crash Bandicoot? It
no.
looks exactly like visually and in terms of its design, it looks exactly like Neo-Cortex's laboratory. So it's like a castle that's its own island that goes really, it's like a spire that goes high into the sky. And it's a mix of like medieval dungeons with like high-tech um, stuff that high-tech like energy conduits and sort of like steampunk arrays that are imbuing like sort of turning these zombies into like cyborg zombies, basically. It feels like you're just in an entirely different game. So
Mm,
um, I'd be interested to hear your take on that. But I do see we're basically at time here. So why don't we just wrap and
sure.
maybe come back to this game later? Maybe not. Depends
Yeah.
on whether we can remember it and whether it sort of rewards more time investment.
Yeah, we'll just make sure then that as you're kind of going through Krat, and trying to navigate all these, puppets that move at different speeds, and some of those ones that kind of just run and explode at you. You got to dodge those guys, but make sure that every once in a while you keep that little lantern lit, and your little friend cricket thing will be talking to you.
And that's right. I forgot the cricket is literally your lantern in this game. Yeah, of course, Brian. We'll do.